The president has made tariffs a core piece of his second-term agenda, touting them as a revenue source and wielding them as a threat against other countries. Joining us now to discuss all this is Edward Fishman, senior research scholar, Center of Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, and author of Chokepoints, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare. Ed, great to see you here, and congrats on the book.
Thanks so much. I'm so happy to be here today.
So you're actually the perfect guy to talk to today. Well, listen, President Trump talking tough on tariffs. He likes tariffs. He likes sanctions, Ed. Tariffs as a policy tool, I'm curious, as you look throughout history, traditionally, typically, how effective are they?
So tariffs throughout history have really been used more as an economic tool, either to raise revenue, as you mentioned before, sometimes to protect industries domestically from foreign competition. The thing that's a little different about how President Trump is proposing to use tariffs, he's trying to use them as a tool of economic warfare, to pressure the Canadians and Mexicans to stop the flow of fentanyl across the US border, to pressure China from stopping to send fentanyl to the United States. So he's really using tariffs as kind of another form of sanction, as something that he could use to get America what it wants.
So given that that's not traditionally how they've been used, what can we extrapolate from history about how effective they might be?
Look, tariffs, generally speaking, if you're using them as a tool of economic warfare, are a very weak tool. So you think about what is a tariff? A tariff is a tax on imports. So even if Trump does put a 25% tariff on Canada, US companies will still be able to import things from Canada. They'll just pay a 25% tax. That's why tariffs, generally speaking, are not good for US companies. By contrast, sanctions block everything, right? So if you impose a sanction, for instance, on a country like Iran, we can't import anything from Iran, right? It's a much more aggressive instrument.
Well, and it's seen as a much more. I mean, if it's dramatic enough that the president is threatening these tariffs against our allies, but if he was to say, "I'm going to put sanctions on Canada," I mean, maybe that would be a line he couldn't cross. I don't know.
I mean, it's not something I would recommend.
Right.
I think tariffs on Canada and Mexico are also not a particularly wise policy. And we'll see if they actually happen. I think when President Trump was gearing up to do this in early February, Monday opened, the markets were not very happy about the prospect of 25% tariffs on our two biggest trading partners, and Trump backtracked. So my strong suspicion is I don't think these tariffs are going to go into effect next week, at least on Canada and Mexico. Will we see an additional 10% tariff on China? May well. And that's actually a big point of what I talk about in Chokepoints, which talks about how Trump developed his China policy. And this has been a consistent theme: tariffs on China, export controls on Chinese tech companies like Huawei. But we haven't yet seen anything like that against Canada and Mexico.
And the title of your book, Edward, is Chokepoints. What are choke points as governments define them?
So historically, choke points have been geographic features, like the Bosphorus, which connects the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. And historically, the only way to really block a choke point was to literally take a Navy ship and park it right in front of it, right? And that's a big part of how warfare happened all the way up through the beginning of the 21st century. What's happened is, in the wake of hyperglobalization, with deeply integrated financial markets and supply chains, now a US official can just sign a document in his or her office in Washington and block these choke points across the world. And so what we're using now aren't so much these geographic choke points, they're economic choke points, like the US dollar, like advanced computer chip technology, and like energy supply chains, in which the US has a dominant position and there are very few substitutes.
And so how is this remake? We've talked a lot about the remaking of the global order over the past, call it decade, right? Where you're not as much seeing this coming together of global economies, but more of a re-separation of those global economies. What then is the outcome of all of these leaning on these choke points?
This is the narrative that I talk about in my book, Chokepoints. Globalization is dead, and we are now living in an age of economic warfare. Sanctions, tariffs, export controls, they are the primary way that big powers like the United States, like China, like Russia compete with one another. And this has been a trend now starting in 2005, 2006, that's just grown exponentially and is going to continue to grow exponentially during Trump's term. So I think where we're headed is really one of two futures. One, where we have still tight financial and economic linkages, but only with other allies, only with other democracies. And where there's another bloc that's led by China, very similar to what it looked like during the Cold War with the sort of West and the Soviet Union. But there's another future, and this is the one I'm actually more worried about. And I think it's where, if Trump were to go ahead with tariffs on Canada and Mexico, it's where it would take us. And that's a more chaotic breakdown of the global economy, in which every nation is sort of for themselves, and companies in the US can't feel confident about long-term investments unless they're in the United States. And where the reason that's bad is not only will it be bad for the United States economically, inflation, slower economic growth, But history shows that when states can't acquire markets and resources through open trade, they're tempted into things like imperialism and conquest and war.
I'm curious, you mentioned a number of choke points that government officials can potentially have at their disposal. Is there one choke point that you would say that typically is the most impactful one?
The US dollar is by far the most important choke point. If you look at it, 90%.
That seems pretty good for the US.
It is. It's why we're the most powerful country in economic warfare. 90% of all foreign exchange transactions include the dollar. So if you're doing trade internationally, you're using the dollar. The thing is, though, there are choke points come and go, and some of the most important emerging choke points are actually under China's control. A key one is critical minerals. And I think if you're looking at the deal that Trump is trying to strike with Volodymyr Zelensky when he's coming to the White House tomorrow, a lot of that is to try to reduce China's ability to weaponize this choke point against the United States.
So I guess my question would be, we know that President Trump views these negotiations as having a winner and a loser, right? We know that from historically how he has operated. With the U.S. still having that powerful U.S. dollar as the most important choke point, will the U.S. win?
Look, I think so far what Trump has been threatening has been tariffs. Tariffs are not weaponizing the dollar as a choke point. They're weaponizing the American consumer, right? The fact that we're a big importer, right? Because remember, tariffs are a tax on imports. Were Trump to go ahead and threaten financial sanctions against Chinese banks, that would be a much more significant threat to be putting on China than tariffs.
Eddie, thank you so much. Really interesting stuff.
Yeah, my pleasure. Great to be here today.
Coming in.